Good morning. Harvest Festival isn't new. 3,300 years ago, the people of Israel were instructed by God in the law that they had to keep Harvest Festival. And there were two obligations on them during the harvest. The first was to worship. And God says over and over again, this is just one of the verses, count 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the standing corn, then celebrate the festival of weeks to the Lord your God by giving a free will offering in proportion to the blessings the Lord your God has given you, and rejoice before the Lord your God at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name. So worship was right at the heart of celebrating harvest. As Stuart's already indicated, for us these days, we don't really think about harvest as being where our food comes from. We know it's happening, but it doesn't really grab us. But for subsistence farmers like the ancient Israelites, or like the majority of people in the world today, harvest is crucial. If you have a bad harvest, you may not actually survive till the next year. If you have a good harvest, it's wonderful. But when you have that good harvest, the call is to praise the Lord. But they were also called to share. They're harvesting the back of our field, the field at the back of our house at the moment. It's potatoes that are in it this year. They are making sure that they give every last potato out of the ground, right into the corners, right round the edges. In fact, Jennifer was worried because the machines look as if they're coming into our garden at times. But that wasn't the way it was to be with the ancient Israelites. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your fields, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigner residing among you. I am the Lord your God. So it was part of their duty to God was to leave part of the harvest behind so that the poor could collect it and live. They had a number of harvest festivals. The first harvest festival was the festival of first fruits. Happened round April, May. It was the beginning of the barley harvest. And the first sheaf of barley that was reaped, the first time you put your sickle to the corn and took that sheaf, that was to be given to the Lord as a way of offering, to say thank you that the harvest was ready. 7 weeks later, 49 days, was the Feast of Weeks, which was also called Pentecost because the feast took place on the 50th day. Now, Pentecost for us, of course, has a completely different significance because it's the day that the Holy Spirit came down upon the church in power. And that's what we look back to. But for the ancient Israelites, Pentecost was the last day of the wheat harvest. And so you gave thanks to God when the harvest was ready before you started reaping it, and you give thanks to God when you brought all the harvest in. And then, again, as Stuart said, harvest goes on all year, and in September was the grape harvest. And once you brought all the grape harvest in, you had the Feast of Tabernacles. But every time you brought the harvest in, you worshipped God. From early on, it became the custom that at the Feast of Pentecost, the book of Ruth was read. Why the book of Ruth? Well, Ruth's story is interesting. It starts in a sad sort of way. Elimelech and Naomi were Israelites who lived in Bethlehem. There was a famine in Bethlehem, so they took their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and they moved to Moab. Shortly after their arrival in Moab, Elimelech died. Mahlon and Chilion married Moabite girls, and then Mahlon and Chilion died. And so there was a household with 3 childless widows, Naomi, Ophrah, and Ruth, her daughters-in-law. to be a widow, to be a childless widow in those days was very, very difficult. It was a male-dominated society. If you didn't have the protection of a man, you were in trouble. You were vulnerable, you had no income, you had nothing. And as Naomi, who was a foreigner in Moab, looked at this, she thought, I might as well go back to Israel. At least in Israel, I've got relatives, I've got friends. She set off to return. Her daughters-in-law said they would go with her, and she did her best to dissuade them. And Orpah eventually listened to her mother-in-law and turned back. Naomi's argument was, if you stay in Moab, there is every chance you'll be able to get married again. And remember, being married is the only way that you're going to make a living. It's the only way you're going to survive. So, girls, go back and find yourselves a husband. Ruth makes a very unusual declaration. She says, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. An amazing declaration of love, of faithfulness, and of faith. Your God will be my God. Ruth's decision to follow Naomi wasn't just because she loved Naomi. It was because she'd come to faith in Naomi's God. And so Ruth and Naomi went back. They went back not to very much. Naomi said, everybody said, the people in Bethlehem, is this Naomi come back? And she said, don't call me Naomi, that means pleasant. She said, call me Mara, that means bitter. Because she says, the Lord's dealt very harshly with me. So there we have Ruth. She's a childless widow. She's poor. She's a foreigner in a time when foreigners just weren't accepted. Not terribly different from the 21st century. She was a refugee, an immigrant, to put it in our terms. But she was a believer. She had faith in God, and she had the most incredible loving heart. And God, because she had faith in him, and because of the love that she had, God was looking after her, although she didn't know it. And we're going to read from Ruth chapter 2. Ruth chapter 2 in verse 1. Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up... Could you turn it down slightly, Peter? It's echoing. Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they called back. Boaz asked the foreman of his harvesters, whose young woman is that? The foreman replied, she is the Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She went into the field and has worked steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you. And whenever you're thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. At this she bowed down with her face to the ground. She exclaimed, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord, she said. You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls. At the mealtime, Boaz said to her, Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar. When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. Even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. That's about 22 litres. It's about half a hundredweight of grain. It's a fair bit of work picking that up in one day. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz, she said. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. She added, That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers. Then Ruth the Moabitess said, He even said to me, Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with his girls, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Notice that Boaz says, May the Lord repay you for what you have done. And notice that it's Boaz that the Lord uses to repay her for what she's done. System has gone into lockdown. God met her need through an obedient servant. It's kind of important that when we do pray for things, we do listen, because God may be saying to us, you are actually the answer to your own prayers. And that does raise the question of, today, what's our response? Because there are still poor, disadvantaged, vulnerable people in the world, and God is still calling his servants to respond to those people and to bless them. The Baptist Missionary Society every year has a harvest appeal, and this year its harvest appeal is for the forgotten families of Syria. Just to remind ourselves, we know about this, don't we? 1 in 4 of the can't read it. Can you read it down there? Well, come and read it on this one. I think I can see it in that. No, I can't. Okay. I know what this side says. More than 250,000 Syrians have been killed in the last 5 years in the conflict. And we hear about more every day in the news, don't we? Over 1 million Syrians have been wounded in the conflict. And again, we've seen on the news the kind of struggle the medical teams are having with limited resources, with hospitals being bombed, with no supplies getting in. 6.6 million Syrians have been displaced from their homes within Syria. 4.8 million are refugees in the Middle East outside of Syria. Add those two together, that's 10.4 million Syrians who are actually refugees. 897,000 Syrians have applied for asylum in the EU, and 1,000 have been settled in the UK. Now, if the technology works, it worked for the last two videos. Because numbers are all okay, but actually seeing people is better. Is it coming? No. Have you got has the thing come up? The start button? It all goes to show we checked it before the service and it worked. Okay. No? Okay, we'll do without. Move on to the next slide then, if you would. The video was looking at what Baptist Missionary Society is doing in Calais, in the jungle. There are BMS people there. And also in Lebanon itself. In the Bekaa Valley, they're providing food aid, they're providing schooling. And the schooling is extremely important. There's one little girl, a lovely little girl on the video. She's 10 years old. She wants to be a French teacher when she grows up. She hasn't been to school for 3 years. BMS, with its partner church in the Bekaa Valley, is running a school for 300 children, which is kind of a drop in the ocean. In Beirut itself, they are also running a project. They're not calling it a school, but basically it is giving education to a group of children. Again, they interview one little girl who hadn't been to school for a year until somebody said to her, "Have you heard about the project in the Baptist church?" And she went along there, and she's now back going to school. So, practical ways of actually impacting these people. But there are 6.6 million of them in Syria, and there's 4.8 million in the Middle East. When you look at what BMS itself is doing, they've got 60 programs for education. They've been able to give support to 50 families. They've got 6 community health workers being trained to go back into these refugee camps. 700 families provided with nappies. Doesn't sound terribly spiritual, does it? But think what a difference that makes to those families. And so on. And BMS is also working around the world, so they've got people working with the migrants in Italy. They've got people working inside Iraq, where again, there are a lot of internally displaced people. But they've also got people working in Uganda and in South Sudan, where again, there is conflict. Well, there's conflict in South Sudan. There are people displaced in South Sudan. There are BMS missionaries in South Sudan itself. There are others in Uganda working with refugees from South Sudan. And in Thailand, there are refugees mainly from Pakistan. But Christians who have fled persecution in Pakistan are in Thailand, and the conditions for them are not terribly much better. What can we do? we can first of all pray. And prayer does change things. The reason we don't see answers to prayer is because we don't pray. We can give, and Jessica's already mentioned the envelopes, and if you give money in those envelopes, it will go to the Baptist Missionary Society for their Syrian refugee work. You can also do something else, and Open Doors, Anne Rose is our representative for Open Doors. Open Doors have set up a petition which is going to the United Nations and to the UK government. And this is the terms of the petition. We call upon our government and the United Nations to ensure that Christians and other minorities enjoy the right to equal citizenship, dignified living conditions, a prominent role in reconciling and rebuilding society. They're looking for 1 million signatures. You can do it online, or even better today, Anne has got copies of the petition, so please see Anne off afterwards and sign the petition. There are some incredibly brave Christians still who have chosen to stay in Syria. I looked on the Open Doors website this morning, and there's a letter from a lady who's actually left Aleppo. She's outside Aleppo. She comes from a church in Aleppo. She said only 10% of the congregation have remained, but there are still 10% of the congregation of that church still in Aleppo. The church is still full because they've got a lot of Muslims who are coming in looking for hope in a difficult place. I also had an email last night from a friend of mine, I've mentioned him before, who lives and works in Aleppo. He's currently in Armenia, which is how he managed to send the email. He's going back on the 14th of October to work in Aleppo, to pastor the church, and to bring medical care. Our brothers and sisters are facing difficult times. As we look at all that God has given us, as we remember the harvest, let's remember our brothers and sisters. Stuart.